thanks, Suraj, and thanks to the organisers. So this is a study which emerged from some conversations that we were having with mainly kind of prevent coordinators and also law enforcement on the front lines in the UK, looking at kind of gaming, puzzling around that. So we're actually starting this by looking at some research in terms of bystanders and the role of bystanders within gaming environments as maybe a possible kind of off-ramping or buffer against engagement with more extreme content. But it quickly evolved into a larger kind of 6 or 7 month project where we're looking at mainly interviewing content moderators, practitioners, so a bit different from Lars and Konstantin looking necessarily at the coalface in terms of expressions of extremism, though we did kind of discuss that with these experts, and looking more in terms of kind of policing what's out there, what's lacking, what else needs to be done. So yeah, this is based off a paper that I did with, inspired by another paper I did with a colleague looking at the policing of the far right online. So in terms of gaming adjacent platforms, I think Konstantin and Lars gave us a very good flavour of the panoply of different platforms out there, but largely we can define these as digital platforms where these were originally created to support the broader kind of gaming community and ecosystem, somewhere to talk to each other, somewhere to congregate, and somewhere to maybe appreciate the skills of other players within gaming itself. So yeah, as colleague Jacob Davey, who's written a great chapter on this, discusses, in terms of pro-social uses, we can think about it being a key kind of digital infrastructure for gamers, and essential for kind of transmission of gaming culture. But on the other side, and this is what kind of, as extremism experts, kind of also tipped mine and Elisa's attention, is the noted use of gaming adjacent platforms within the attack, execution, and planning of lone actor terrorists. So one of the earliest noted examples is David Somboli, who committed to shooting in Munich, largely kind of cleaving to more kind of right-wing extremist or neo-Nazi ideology, and his engagement with kind of National Socialist communities on the Steam platform. This is something that Florian Hartleb has written about in his book on the age of lone actor terrorism. You can also see its footprints in terms of organisation as well, in terms of the Charlottesville protests that then turned violent in 2017, as well as for red teaming activities and coordination around influence campaigns and so-called meme warfare in relation to key elections. So another one that Juliet Ebner and Jacob Davey talk about is the use of Discord servers in relation to the German federal election. Then in terms of more recent attacks, and as Konstantin and Lars talked about, we're obviously familiar with the Halle terror attack attempt there in order to live stream the attack using Twitch, and also the Christchurch shooting, that mainly on Facebook, not necessarily on these gaming adjacent platforms. And then DLive used quite heavily in relation to the live stream of the Capitol riots, monetization relating to that, as well as the more recent Buffalo terror attack, using both Discord to agglomerate writings and diaries around attack planning, but also again trying to use Twitch. The live stream was taken down, I think, after 2 minutes. So there's been great learning on this. The reason why so the relevance of these platforms, I think, is keen to stress both in terms of that potential kind of threat profile, But also it's quite an interesting window to see how adversarial shifts on more kind of regulated platforms has diversified the broader ecosystem of extremism and extremist movements more broadly into these more diffuse and different spaces. And as I'll talk about in some of our findings, one thing that was keenly noticed upon was this process of content funneling. So you'd have kind of extremist actors maybe using kind of games in order to then invite people to more kind of enclosed or kind of closed spaces on places like Discord for more kind of, say, ideological conversations. So we're looking at that, but also looking at how it's policed, which I'll get to in a minute. So yeah, these are the key kind of research questions which we were looking at. We were mainly interested in looking at Twitch, Steam, and Discord as they're the most noticed examples. But as Konstantin and Lars says, there's a wider array of platforms. We didn't look at, for example, kind of game modding platforms when we were asking questions of the experts. So we broadly just touched upon things like what expressions they come across in their research and practice, what approaches, if they're the coalface, what approaches are used in terms of content moderation, if at all. And I think here what's keen to express is that we're looking mainly at extremism rather than terrorism. Obviously they are interlinked, but we're looking here at kind of the broad aspects of ideologies that might also be non-violent in terms of their expression. And then we got them to do a bit of blue sky thinking about what opportunities there were in terms of PCVE on these platforms, mainly around kind of counter narratives, but other interventions as well. So yeah, we did 13 interviews between May and July this year with content moderators, PCV practitioners, and industry researchers. We did try to speak to the platforms as well, and we hope to do so more in the future. In terms of, we also looked at kind of the terms of service, so we did a bit of a qualitative document analysis there, mainly in terms of content around kind of hate speech, extremist-related content in terms of kind of gore and violence, as well as terrorism. We also conducted a systematic review, which didn't really take that long, in relation to extremism studies and related to gaming adjacent platforms in particular. What we can kind of say is that this 2024 has been quite a kind of a growth year in terms of this topic. So I would definitely read Konstantin and Lars's work, as well as several others who are looking at this issue. In terms of the results, I have to say that we're just, sorry for the messy slides, it's just that we're in the process of actually just kind of picking through some of the content that was relayed to us by the experts and trying to kind of make sense of kind of key codes and key themes. One of the things that we found was there was quite a keen focus on right-wing extremism, and this is perhaps not surprising given the profile of the kind of high-profile examples that I gave you at the head of the presentation. But this was kind of involving the extreme right, so looking at kind of expressions of Nazism, white supremacy more broadly, how this was kind of wrapped up in some more kind of prejudicial and conspiratorial language around kind of anti-Semitism, racism, misogyny, homophobia, and connections to other kind of conspiracy myth movements like QAnon. we didn't have so much in terms of Islamist extremism that was noted in terms of mods and other things surrounding this this ideology. But I thought what was the most interesting was more kind of hybrid extremism or extremism adjacent phenomena. So a lot of talk around kind of CSAM material, fixations on school shootings, graphic sexual content, graphic violence. So some of these kind of fixations kind of that come within the sphere of kind of not salad bar extremism, but kind of mixed, unstable and unclear is the language that's most recently adopted in the UK prevent sphere. In terms of radicalisation, as I noted before, saw a lot of kind of content funneling happening. So this was one quote from one of the respondents. So they talked in the language of grooming or cultivation starting on games, where you have this kind of matchmaking, weird matchmaking happen, and then building rapport in order to move that onto adjacent platforms where there's less kind of monitoring happening. Some of this was stuff which people were seeking out, but other people were stumbling upon. The kind of it broadly kind of maps on this more kind of post-organizational picture of networks rather than discrete kind of groups or movements necessarily in the online space. And then in terms of recruitment, there was a lot of building on things like hypermasculine kind of appeals in relation to games like GTA 5 and Call of Duty, and also commenting on the kind of team bonding and building, which we've seen in terms of extremist actors kind of reliving particular moments in history through these kind of military campaigns online and using that, but also in terms of just being on one of these servers and being kind of cheered on by other ideological adherents. It kind of builds that in-group and also perhaps emboldening for further action offline as well. In terms of content moderation, what we saw here was that there has been kind of aspects of best practice. So we started with like asking them, what do you think would help for a healthy platform? And a lot of the content moderators were hungering after kind of stricter policies on bans and removals. They were constantly seeing people who had been kind of given bans and then coming back on, causing harm and other behaviours happening, and then being kind of shut off. So in terms of one of our recommendations from this is to have more kind of transparent kind of policies in relation to this with the public in order to know kind of what goes on behind the scenes, as it were, and to allay any doubts that people are being let back on and causing further harm to users. Another issue that we kind of talked about with a lot of these users was around, the moderators especially, was around kind of borderline content. So a lot of platforms doing their kind of just desserts in terms of escalating things to law enforcement if they had a specific kind of violent aspect to it. But when it came to more kind of political, culture war, kind of fringe content, it tended to be less kind of prioritized within escalation protocols, mainly because of its kind of sheer prevalence on some of these platforms. In terms of what they told us in terms of what they would like, one of them, which comes as no surprise to people maybe in the tech sector, was around supporting moderators in terms of well-being plans against harmful content, but perhaps also some more nuance in terms of threat escalation procedures. I think this is one thing around risk mapping of users, looking at behaviours, extremist kind of adjacent behaviours that might be used to then build up maybe a bit more of a profile and a picture of individuals that might be then keen to exert more harm online or more harm offline that needs to be developed. Then just finally, in terms of counter-narratives, there's a bit of a mixed feeling about how effective these were. And the kind of key takeaway from a lot of these discussions was the topic of AI. So how we could use bots in order to automatically ban certain words on particular servers, or using it to alert moderators around kind of threat behavior signals, just because of the interactive nature of these platforms. There's obviously limitations there in terms of the technology, especially when it goes beyond text. So that's something to bear in mind. And then in terms of specific, adopting specific protocols, a lot of our respondents were keen to kind of look at kind of greater measures that could be to be used in order to moderate content on particularly the more server-based gaming adjacent platforms. Okay, so just to conclude then, what we've found from this study is that it's no surprise to maybe interested people, is that a lot of these platforms are in the early stages of kind of interdicting this kind of content on these platforms. What we kind of suggest from the comments of the respondents is that there needs to be more kind of proactive rather than reactive efforts and learnings maybe from other social media platforms. This is a key question that kept on coming up and again. How are gaming adjacent platforms any different from a discussion platform or a social media platform? That might have some ramifications in terms of regulation, but that's interesting. Another one which came out that we thought was about how to get ahead of the curve and what preventative work could be done, specifically around the more toxic areas of gaming culture, and how we could perhaps think about educational initiatives and other kind of safety by design initiatives that kind of incentivize better communication and behavior on these platforms. And that's about it. So we did have some other recommendations for platforms and regulators, for researchers, and for practitioners and policymakers. But I've largely kind of covered these in passing, so I'll just leave those up for discussion. Thank you very much.